The southern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh is in turmoil over the demand for Telangana, which seems to have been conceded by the central government. Immediately after, demands for new states, some old, some new, have emerged from almost throughout the country, from Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Bihar, West Bengal, and so on. What does this imply for the Indian polity? What does this imply for the notion of a multicultural nation? To discuss these and related issues, we have with us today Professor Ayesha Kidwai of the Center for Linguistic Studies, Jawahar Lal Nehru University. New states were formed in India on the basis of language, the so-called linguistic organization of states, particularly in southern India and partially in the west and in the east. The Telangana demand and statehood position goes against this notion of linguistic states. What implications does that have?
In the early 1920s, the Congress had decided that it will use Hindustani for its sessions in a bid to unify India. The first opposition to the use of Hindustani was actually articulated by the Andhra movement, the greater Andhra movement, and the precursors of that, really. Now, this forced the Indian National Congress actually to change it in 1925 to change all its proceedings to English. Post-independence, the Congress decided to renege on its assurance that it would do a linguistic reorganization of states. And again, it was the Andhra movement, which, along with Tamil Nadu, which forced the Indian state, and particularly the Constituent Assembly at that time, to acknowledge that there were larger aspirations which were based on regions and the use of, defined in linguistic terms, but as a lingua franca based.
Right.
So regional languages which were lingua francas. The Telangana movement was not a linguistic movement. It was part of the Telugu was the language, and it continues to be the language of Telangana. But there were there was regional backwardness and a communist-led movement for greater equity and equality. Now, today, when the Telangana movement is being encouraged, the language issue is at the background.
Right.
But nevertheless, once this is allowed, linguistic identities, which are rife in India, and in many cases justifiably so, will demand that more and more smaller states be made.
Now, while the linguistic organization took place in the south and in the east, in the west, the central and north Indian states were by and large left out of this process, partly because sub-regional linguistic identities were perhaps not as strong, and there was also a political drive towards homogenization of this region under a Hindi rubric. So many of these demands in North and Central India are perhaps left over in some sense of nascent sub-regional and linguistic identities.
Well, I think that in 1947, the central question, because these were also the states that were deeply affected by partition, maybe up to Madhya Pradesh. And so the central dichotomy that was evolved was between Hindi and Urdu. Right? And the Muslim minority was perhaps the biggest concern of how to deal with that. And for the next 50 years after partition, this has been the polemic. So Bihar introduced Urdu as a second official language, then UP did so. Because the constitution said that Hindi in the Devanagari script is the language of India. To say that these are sub-national or sub-regional linguistic identities, I think in fact would be stretching it for a large part of the North. But certainly we've seen the development and the articulation of distinct identities which perhaps do not have a precursor before 1947. One case is the case of Maithili. So that is the only language in independent India, or post the first articulation of the 8th schedule, to make it by a 2001 amendment into the 8th schedule of the constitution as languages.
Sure.
And that has been accompanied by a great articulation of this Mithila culture,
Right.
Mithila identity. So how much does, that this had a precursor in 1947 is a business of myth making.
But there was also a trend during the 50s and the 60s, particularly around the Hindi language as the national language slogan. There was a drive which almost drove people to declare, particularly in the 61 census and onwards, that their mother tongue was Hindi, while earlier they may have declared it as Bhojpuri or Maithili or something like that. So, for example, today there is a demand in Bihar for a new state of Purvanchal, with Varanasi as the capital, embracing parts of UP and parts of Bihar, built around Bhojpuri as a language.
But there's, certainly I think the Lohiite movement and the post the reorganization of states, there was in a large section of the Hindi heartland a proposal, that, a claim towards Hindi. But the claims for Bhojpuri and Angika, Bajika, you name it, all the varieties of Hindi that you have in those areas, they didn't die down. So the census actually did this clever trick whereby under Hindi,
That's right.
they claim, they count 50 languages.
Right.
So Maithili till the 1991 census was under Hindi.
That's right.
And then it has been elevated and picked out, because I think the linguistic identity wasn't seen as a statehood identity until when there are political circumstances which then raise it. A good example is Bodo. Right? The Bodo issue in Assam has been a very live one for many decades. Bodoland and Bodo now makes it into the 2001 census. What you see in census figures is that as political movements build up, claims for the languages build up.
Sure.
So that's what's happened with Maithili. Bhojpuri, I'm sure, by the next census, if we don't get this land, this state, is going to be the same.
And some of them are maybe linguistic along the lines that we have discussed, and some may cross other bounds. The Bundelkhand area, for instance, may not have a very hard linguistic expression, but may have fairly strong cultural dimensions to it.
Yes, and also historical dimensions. So I find reference in the current discourse to the prior princely states.
Right.
And it's ironic and interesting that, 60 years after independence, we should make reference to these things as to the states as defining a common identity, cultural identity. Now, it's true, of course, that, every variety, dialect, if you will, or smaller language will have a linguistic cultural identity. But I think it's also important to realize that communities don't only define themselves by one language in India. They define themselves by the regional language they speak, by the fact that they are multilingual. And in the Hindi heartland, this has been, I think, for the last 500 years, there's been a major language. There has been a smaller language that you speak at your home. The classic cases of Avdi or Braj.
Yes.
Right? And these themselves have not been the basis for defining specificity of culture and actually disconnecting one culture from the other. So in a sense, I think that the question of statehood is a political one. It is dressed up in the issue of linguistic identity and cultural identity. But ultimately, when these are raised, these got nothing to really do with language.
So how do you see this apparent dichotomy playing out? A demand for smaller states, and the smallness is based on what? How do you divide? Is it just a colonial drawing of lines on a map the way they were done in Africa or elsewhere? or is there some other cultural, linguistic, whatever means by which you define entities?
I think we must appreciate that what underlies the demands for states is a complex of factors. In the recent demands, in fact, the issue of language and culture is sort of, in most of the demands, is like a pillion rider. Quite different from what happened in the 1950s, where language and culture and a consciousness of history was actually the main
So
issue.
you would say today a large part of the demands for smaller states really comes from political considerations driven by regional elites riding on language and culture,
Yes.
rather than stemming from language and culture per se.
Yes, and in fact, if you notice that the statements have been fairly muted about language and
Right.
culture.
Thank you very much, Ayesha.